Okay, let's begin. So today's class, as we continue on now, is focused on, is focused on issues related to organ donation, with a particular goal of trying to discuss issues that are coming up new in the field of organ donation. Now, I refer to organ donation, I mean posthumous organ donation, meaning end-of-life questions of organ donation. There's, of course, a whole enterprise and possibility of organ donation uh, during one's lifetime and donating kidney and altruistic donation, which is a wonderful phenomenon. But that's not our focus today. Our focus today relates to the questions of end of life and the possibility of organ donation. And when we define the moment of death, which makes organ donation possible, and also to raise some of the questions that are coming up now because of new technologies. And what we're trying to show you is that some of the new technologies that are out there today, they're making organ donation possible in scenarios and situations which really wasn't possible in previous years, but is also raising some really interesting and difficult ethical, moral, halachic questions as well. When we I'll start with, we have unfortunately, this case comes up. A Matai, as you might know, is continuing the work of the Halachic Organ Donor Society. And we have an initiative called Option 18. You can actually see it on option18.org. And it'll take you directly to A Matai's website where we discuss organ donation. And there are a lot of myths about organ donation in Judaism, which are very, very, very harmful. I mean, there are some serious issues, but there are also myths that just aren't the real issues and cause a lot of angst and a lot of distraction and a lot of people just, what can I say? Meaning, not saying this in a critical way, I'm saying, but in a way that there are all these things that are barriers which really shouldn't be barriers. So let me just pull this up. If you look, so if you look here, so we try to lay some of these 5 misconceptions out. And I literally had this week where someone, was a case, very tragic case of death. I won't get into details now, but someone quite young. And one of the barriers to organ donation there was the mom wondering, well, is organ donation going to preclude, tchiat hametim, right? Because the fear was, well, if they've lost the organ, they've lost the kidney, the heart, whatever it's going to be, so then they won't be able to be brought back. And as we note here, there's no such source that indicates this, and organs disintegrate, and Holocaust martyrs, right, were cremated, but no one thinks they're not going to come back in the resurrection of the dead. And there are all sorts of myths out there that cause issues for people not wanting to donate organs. Organ donation, by the way, used to be thought of as a young man's thing, right? Now, it's the type of thing where you imagine going to be an organ donor if you're 20 and God forbid there's a car accident or something like that. But today we can retrieve organs and do retrieve organs for people at much later ages. In New York City, a few months ago, I was speaking about this, and someone there is involved in the organ procurement organization told me they had recently retrieved a liver of a 92-year-old. Okay? So as I said to the person, clearly they hadn't drunken anything at the Kiddush Club. So there you go, right? In other words, but the point I'm trying to get is that, and yesterday I was in Hadassah Hospital in Israel, and they were telling me that they do organ retrievals into the 80s. Now, this doesn't mean, however, that organ retrieval is always possible. In fact, the vast majority of times, organ retrieval is not possible. So I even got a call earlier this year of someone who was really heartbroken because their mother had passed away and wanted to be an organ donor, and she had died. It was the father. I think it was the father, actually. He had died at the home hospice, and they thought that this had prevented organ donation. And as I explained to them, it is true that dying at home is going to prevent organ donation, but your father also had cancer, And so we're not going to retrieve organs there when there's cancer all over the body. Right now, so there are many myths about this that, in both directions. People think it's always possible. It's not always possible. People also think that there's certain ideas out there that preclude organ donation when that's not the case. But the biggest issue, and really the fundamental issue in which this is really important, relates to the question of when is the time of death. That is truly the issue, the primary issue when it comes to thinking about organ donation. And let's understand what we're talking about, because this is all changing, but it's important to understand the historic debate. So classically, there's a whole history here, which I'm not going to get into, but already in the late 60s, this sort of develops and emerges as we move forward as well. The phenomenon of what we sometimes call as brain death, but really should be called brain stem death, and in halachic terms actually referred to as respiratory brain death. So this emerges in the 50s, but certainly in the late 60s. And the question becomes is there a point where the organs remain vital and therefore could be retrieved, but the person, the organism, is deemed dead? Let's think about that for a moment. You have organs that are functioning, that are vital, such as, for example, the heart, which people focus on because it's palpable, right? But it doesn't have to be the heart, it could be other organs as well. And those remain vital, but nonetheless, we've declared someone to have already passed away. So this is a complicated question. You say, well, let's let the doctors decide that question, right? I mean, this really, you might think intuitively, oh, this is a scientific question. But the truth is, it's not really a scientific question, because if you think about it for a moment, science can tell us all sorts of things about how the organism, right, stops functioning, and science can tell us and describe the process of how things break down. But the question becomes, where along that line do you draw the moment of death? And the assumption, for now at least, we'll discuss a little bit more later on, is that we're not going to retrieve organs unless the person is dead. That's what's known as the dead donor rule. You don't take someone's organs, no matter what shape they might be in, even though you have a few minutes to live, whatever else it might be, you don't take the organs until they are dead. And so if that's the case, it becomes very critical to determine when is the moment of death. And here, as people both in favor and against halachic organ donation, right, or respiratory brain death criteria, will admit this is not a matter of science. I have here on the left Rabbi J. David Bleich, who's one of the opponents of brain death criteria, and Rabbi Professor Avram Steinberg is one of the biggest advocates of it. And they both agree that the definition of death, as Rabbi Bleich writes, cannot be derived from medical facts or scientific investigation alone. As Professor Steinberg adds, on the right, biologically, death is a progressive process in which various cells, tissues, and organs die at different times, depending on their sensitivity to the absence of oxygen energy sources. The determination of that moment is social, philosophical, legal, or religious acceptance of a scientific criterion, even if some cells or bodies are still biologically alive. And we see this already in the Chazal, by the way. Of course, we do not have the science that we have. But the moment of death has halachic significance for many reasons, most prominently when it comes to questions of tuma and tahara, of purity and impurity. And you see the Mishnah Olo tells us the person is not metameh, does not defile as a corpse, right, unless they're dead. If they're goses, right, if they're about to die, in the process of dying, that still nonetheless doesn't make them metameh. But if they be a point where you say they're dead, even if there is some form of reflex, and the case example they give is if their heads have been cut off, even though they're moving convulsively, like think of a lizard, right? It moves convulsively, but nonetheless, we say that their animal or human would be dead. So what is critical is to understand is what are the ways in which we can assert, what is the criteria in which we can assert that someone is dead, with the assumption being that what is death? Irreversible. And that seems to be always be the factor which you've always thought of. And when I see it's going to become complicated, but that has always been the factor. We assume that that's what defines death. And so the question became, when we have this tremendously powerful technology which can stop the process, as it were, and have a situation where we get to the point where the person can no longer breathe spontaneously on their own ever. It's irreversible damage. They'll never be able to breathe on their own. And they are totally unresponsive to the outside. They don't have reflexes. They don't react, right, to the world. Is that person dead? The nafka or the ramification is that we have, because of technology, the ability to keep the person oxygenated and keep their heart beating and maintain the organs to be vital because of a ventilator and other types of technology. And so the question then becomes is that moment the moment where we'll draw the line and say, yes, that is death, which then allows us to retrieve the organs which remain vital, even though the organism, the human, is no longer alive? Or do you say, no, right? As long as the heart and other organs remain vital, that means that they're actually alive. And that being the case, we would not say that is a moment of death, which would preclude organ donation. Now, organ donation is an amazing phenomenon because organ failure is actually one of those things. If we had enough organs, we can heal, right? There are many things we can't heal, but organ failure is something we can heal if we can replace that organ. And so all of us benefit from that system. In practice today, all of us are benefiting from that system. We all know that if we'd ever need an organ, in theory, right, the organ would become available, or it could be available, it could save us. And the question becomes is, does halacha recognize that moment of, in the process, as being a moment of death in order to allow organ donation to take place? So this is the classic great debate on this. And I'll show you where the debate comes from, but those we're going to see, it's going to get a bit complicated here. So if you take a look, right, so you want to note the fact that you ask us, well, how do we know when a person is dead according to halacha? And the answer is this was not always a perfect process. So for example, the Gemara in Mishnah, or the Shektana and Smachot, tells us that there are times when we would check up to 3 days into the cemetery to make sure the person is truly dead, because there have been incidents where we found people to be living, right? And various other ways in which there have been times when people have become very nervous about death. But nonetheless, we generally determine death, but we understand that it's not always easy for us to know it in the moment. And one of the more famous incidents when this came up is in the 19th century. We'll come back to this later on. But in the 19th century in Europe, they had a massive fear that people were being buried alive, and all sorts of terrible stories along these lines. And this, my friend, is where the expression "saved by the bell" comes from. Saved by the Bell, we think is that, quirky TV show, and you're about to get detention, and all of a sudden you get saved by the bell, and your principal doesn't give you detention, right? But the origins of the term saved by the bell is, at some point in the 19th century in Europe, they would bury people with their hands on a bell. So that way, if they were buried alive, they could ring the bell, alert people that they're alive, and they would be saved by the bell. Okay. Now you might say, oh, that's crazy, but that wouldn't happen today, right? With our technology and all of that. And yet, February 2023, Iowa, and in New York, we have 2 incidents where people have been declared dead, but 3 hours later, staff at the funeral home discovered the woman is alive and breathing. And this happened once in New York, happened in a hospice in Iowa, right? And all sorts of terrible cases like this, which I don't want to scare anyone. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to, right? But the phenomenon of making a mistake can happen. And nonetheless, we don't say, right, that we don't declare people dead. In fact, if you look in the Achronim, they discuss this phenomenon and say, listen, at the end of the day, we have a way of declaring people dead. And as the Chidah puts it, if in one of many tens of thousands of cases it happens he's alive, it doesn't matter, right? You follow the test that we have. And the Chidah even gives this really crazy line. And if it ends up being that we end up buried someone alive, don't worry. It's probably that they are chayav mita anyway because they were a sinner. Pretty remarkable statement. As you can imagine, the Chidah was not much of a pulpit rabbi. Can you imagine? Bedside manner. Right? But nonetheless, the point I'm trying to get at is that the time of death wasn't always a perfect process in designating it, but nonetheless, we felt comfortable in the vast majority of times with those decisions, and we declared death. And the question then became, particularly in the 19th century, when this great fear emerges in Europe, well, how exactly do we test for death? Because we do want to make it a more exact process. And the Gemara actually tells us, in Yuma Daf Pei Hey, tells us a certain circumstance in which you have a case where there's an avalanche, not sure if the person is dead or alive, if they're there or not there, it's Shabbat. You violate Shabbat to save them because Safek B'koach Nefesh is Docha Shabbat. And then we have a situation we're not sure the person is alive. So the rabbis teach, how do you search? And ultimately, the answer they give there, which is also brought down in Shulchan Aruch, is you check to their nose, and if you feel there's no life, for sure, he is dead. Okay? What does that mean? What are they doing by checking the nose? The feather test. Right? We might call the feather test, right? They're examining to see, is there anything coming from this area? Now, the question becomes is, why is this test significant? And Abba Shaul tells us in the Gemara, the reason why it's significant because it relates to the psukim in Breshit, which talk about Nishma or Nefesh Kol Chai, which talk about the fact that the Ruach comes through the Af, the Ruach comes through the nose. And if that is the case, then it seems that life is indicated by what's going on in the nose, namely respiration. And if you look in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, this is the writings of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, right, the Baal Tanya. So he explains that you check bokim al chotmo. Why do we check to the nostril? Ki ikar heker chiyutu b'chotem, because the ikar sign of life is in the nostril, as it says in the Torah, kol asher nishma ruach chayim be'apav, in the nostrils. Now, this is a very interesting source because it might indicate to us that the feather test isn't just a test, but it's actually presenting a criterion for death. That is to say that the Gemara gives us a test, but the test is indicative of a larger statement, namely, respiration is the criterion for death, or the lack of respiration becomes the criterion for death. So in the 19th century, when all of Europe is up in arms, are we burying people alive? And they bring us to the great posek, the Khatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, who tells us, it says, listen, there's always been a Masorah about how to determine death. Maybe it's been lost, or maybe we just followed whatever the science was of then, of the times. Whatever it might be, we relied, though, on this idea, and he quotes the pasuk and the Gemara in Yuma to say, Kol asher nishma ruach hayim be'apav is what matters. And so, in a special newsletter, later republished in the Igor Moshe, but initially distributed by the Association of Orthodox Jewish Scientists, Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal writes a letter, a tshuva, which is then translated by his son-in-law and disseminated by his son-in-law, Rav Moshe David Tendler. And Rav Moshe says, and here's the logic, if no sign of life is detected when the nose is examined, the person is deemed to be dead solely on the basis of his inability to breathe. If he's shallow respiration, he's alive. But if he can't breathe anymore at all, he's dead. And the fact that the ventilator inflates the lungs, even though the patient is actually dead, is irrelevant, right? This is not regarded as a sign of life. The breath of life, Nishmat Ruach Hayim Ba'apav, requires the patient breathe on their own. So according to this argument, you could say that the test given by the Gemara is actually establishing a criteria for death. Criteria for death is the loss of respiration. And once there's the loss of spontaneous respiration and the person is unresponsive to the environment, as they were in the case in Gemara and Yuma, right? Then we say that person is dead, which allows that for the retrieval of organs and organ donation. But you could argue and say, no, the Gemara and Yuma is only telling us how to test if we don't know, if there's no signs of life. But should there be signs of life, well, then we don't care about the cessation of respiration. And this is really articulated by a few poskim today who are against the brain death criteria, and one of which is Rav Zilberstein and Bnei Brak, quoting the name of his father-in-law, Rabbi Yosef Zatzal, who basically says it's true that breathing is a sign of life. Right? And that is true. And therefore, if we have no other signs of life, we will follow the lack of breathing as indication. But if there are other signs that a person is alive, we cannot make a determination based on the cessation of respiration. And so the fact that we stop the process, the person doesn't breathe on their own anymore, but their heart is still working, the organs remain vital, they're sweating, they have a temperature, whatever it is, all of this indicates then that the person remains alive. So where do we land on this issue? Because what we end up having is, first of all, there's a big machlok out of Sen Chatab Sofer. There's a big machlok what exactly Moshe Feinstein said. There's a big machlok what Shlomo Zalman said. There's a big machlok what exactly what Rabbi Yosef said. We're doing great here. But the end result is that in practice, the religious Zionist community, following the psak of the chief rabbinate here in Israel, has overwhelming, universally, in fact, right, with a full consensus, accepted respiratory brain death, with the focus being again on the respiratory part. We don't really care about the brain. We can test in the brain. It's the neurological criteria, right? Neurological testing. But what we really care about is the fact that the person never can breathe again. This is the psak which was issued by the chief rabbis in '86, led by Rav Shapiro, Mordechai Yahu, and Rav Shal Yisraeli, and has been affirmed by the religious Zionists across the board. As far as I know, it's the only issue that religious Zionist poskim actually really agree on. It's pretty wild, right? Religious Zionist poskim don't agree upon conversion standards. They don't agree about kashrut standards. They don't agree about women's issues when we're going to the army. They don't agree about the role of the chief rabbi. They don't agree about anything. They don't agree about what bracha you say on Bamba. Okay? The only thing that religious Zionist rabbis agree upon is a positive outlook for the state of Israel, and that respiratory brain death is the halachic criterion for death. Now, when you say religious Zionists, it doesn't mean they're the only ones. I mean, there are those who are religious Zionists who affirm this, but this is the universal practice of religious Zionist rabbis in Israel, as opposed to, right, the Haredi world, which led by, again, there's a lot of controversy, particularly about what Shlomo Zalman's position actually was, but led by the psakim of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rabbi Yosef, have determined that as long as the heart is still beating, we cannot retrieve organs. Any taking of the organs in that moment is considered to be shvichut damim, and therefore you cannot do it. Okay, and in practice, that is what the Haredi world does. In Israel, the Haredi world does not donate after brain death here in Israel. And in America and Canada and England, it became a very big fight, very divisive issue. And some yes, some no, some don't want to talk about it, whatever it might be. And became a really big deal. And that's sort of where we're at in that debate. Now, in the old days, you could have just stopped the conversation there and said, okay, this is the machloket. This is what we have right now. There's not much more to say about it. However, there are all sorts of interesting technological advances, which I want to discuss with you now. So for starters, again, what I said earlier, I believe to be true. The main issue, the real issue, is over if the person is dead. If they're dead, even though, right, doing a surgical removal of organs is normally be prohibited, right? Let's say autopsies, or I won't get to that issue right now. Autopsies are more complex, but it generally wouldn't allow you to benefit from the body or to delay the burial or to do the surgeries on the body. But nonetheless, because you're doing this for the sake of pikuach nefesh, for saving a life, it would be mutter. So the question is only, is the person deemed to be dead? Now, historically, when this issue was been discussed over the years, there are there really weren't opportunities for much organ donation after cardiac death, after death by cardiological criteria. Maybe cornea, skin, but not of the major organs. And so this was a major issue because if you don't accept this, and then you don't have organs, let's say in Israel, for example, right? And it became a big issue because all Jews receive organs, but if you're not going to donate, what's the morality of that, right? This became a big issue. Now, what is going on, there are a number of interesting phenomena today in which there are two things to note. Firstly, is that if a person doesn't accept brain death as a criteria for death, but would say that at that moment in time you can withdraw, let's say, the respirator, ventilator, or other life extending, depending on how you define it, right? But if you're not accepting brain death, life extending measures. So today it is certainly possible in a very controlled environment of the hospital that if you would accept brain death as being sufficient to remove a ventilator, that would allow organ donation to take place afterwards as well. Not as many organs, not as many organs remain vital. So the heart isn't going to be able to remain vital in those circumstances. But there are certainly cases where it's possible to, if you accept the idea that you can remove the ventilator, or although Yashiv felt the ventilator can't be removed, you can stop everything else. But Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach clearly stated, according to those who think you didn't accept brain death, it's clearly stated that in a case of brainstem death, you could remove the ventilator. And that being the case, it's important to note that if you don't accept brain death, but would allow the removal of the ventilator, this will still allow organ donation. I know this to be true because at Ematai, we've had at least 2 cases in the last year in which, not really for halachic reasons, but for emotional, whatever it was, the various factors in the cases, the parents weren't willing to have organ retrieval before the heart stopped, even though they intellectually understood that their child had died. And through a very coordinated process, the ventilator was removed, the heart stopped, and organs were retrieved in both of those cases. And this is very important to note because for those who would hold us in between position, that will allow for organ retrieval in those cases. The other interesting development, which is super important, is that in yesteryear, if a person's heart stops, they have cardiac arrest, they're brought to the hospital, they can't, revive the person, there's no opportunity for organ donation there. Okay. Today, sort of led by Spain, there's a protocol in Spain, but it's going on other places as well, including in Israel. And literally last night, I was on the call with leading researchers at NYU, a hospital in New York City. This is also going on in Canada. There is sometimes opportunity for someone who's uncontrolled, meaning it wasn't planned by withdrawing anything, donation after cardiac death. And what that means is that there are ways to keep an organ, certain organs, maybe the lungs, kidney, liver, vital, even after cardiac death, which wouldn't have been possible years ago, but today is possible because of technology, including an ECMO machine and other factors as well. This is still a area of development, right, where they're still working this out. But in Israel, the protocol has worked over the last 6, 7 years. I think 45 kidneys have been recovered over in 5 years, which, it's 45 lives. That's nothing to sneeze about. And they're working now on doing it for livers and lungs as well. In the Israeli case, what this involves is keeping a certain amount of ventilation going, resuscitation going in the ambulance. The protocol they're trying in New York right now, I don't get all the details here, but is to keep a very specific type of oxygen provided going to someone, even after they've been declared dead by cardiac death, to keep the lungs vital. The organism, again, is dead. The heart has stopped beating, but we can keep the lungs vital. My friends, this is unbelievable. Right? Like, just think about this for a moment. You have someone who has had cardiac arrest. The heart has stopped. The lungs aren't breathing, but we can attach the person to a machine and maintain the lungs' vitality into the point where we can retrieve, right, the lung at this point. It's incredible. And this sort of like this incredible development, and we'll see where this all goes. But the point I'm trying to stress is that even after cardiac death, which happens, that's the majority of ways death happens. 98%, 98, 99% of times, the way that death gets declared is by the cessation of the heartbeat. So you understand, brain death, organ donation, doesn't happen that often. To give you a certain sense of how often it can happen. So in the whole state of Israel, 9 million people, there were about 450 potential cases of brain death in 2022. Of those 450 cases, only 180, in fact, were cases where there was A, brain death, and B, organs were retrievable. The state of the body was healthy enough and retrievable. And of those cases, about 57% agreed to donate in those circumstances. So in practice, the question of organ donation after brain death came up once every other day in the entire state of Israel, 9 million people. So it's not an opportunity that comes up every day, which is why when it comes up, it's a big deal. And that's why if there are ways of retrieving organs even after cardiac death, this would be a great development, because we'd be able to increase the number of organs that are available, and we'd be able to do it in a way where there's no controversy in halachic circles with regard to cardiac death. I should stress that around the world, Western countries and beyond, brain stem death is the criteria for death. Right? And in fact, it's important to know, it's not that there are two types of death, brain death and cardiac death. It's that the cessation of respiration is a definition of death. There are different tests for that. One test for that is the fact the heart stopped beating. That's how you know that the brain has died as well, because there's no blood flow. But the point is to understand is that in the scientific world, in the legal world, brain stem death has been accepted around the world, but within halachic circles, this remains a debate. And what I'm trying to explain now is that the phenomenon of organ donation might be separatable from that debate. And we, as technology improves, will have the opportunity to retrieve organs even after cardiac death, which would be a wonderful development. However, here comes the however. Let me just answer the question that Joyce asked. Is tissues viewed differently? So tissues is viewed a little bit differently, but there's certainly a skin bank in Israel and elsewhere. The reason why it's viewed a little bit differently is that it's not it may or may not be pikuach nefesh formally, like properly. It also isn't necessarily used immediately because there's a skin bank, for example. And but we all know that if you need skin for various reasons, or let's say a heart valve or a cornea, it is a tremendous resource, of course, of health for that person. And therefore, by and large, many poskim will allow the retrieval of tissue as well. And so that's important to note when that is a possibility. Sometimes it becomes a little bit tricky for Chevra Kadishas, but a well-prepared Chevra Kadisha will certainly know how to do a tahara in those circumstances, and that's not a barrier to it. Now, what I was saying beforehand is that this new technology is incredible, but this new technology is also raising a lot of issues. And not in the cases I mentioned before. The cases I mentioned before, there's the irreversible cessation of either the respiratory system or the heart. And those have stopped working, but we're able to keep the organs vital. What happens in a world in which nothing is fully irreversible, in which the phenomenon of dying looks different because it's possible that the heart has stopped beating permanently, or the person has stopped breathing permanently? But if we would want to, we could get that heart beating again, and we could get those lungs breathing again. Now, the question might be, why would you do that? Because the rest of the organism is so unhealthy, right? There's no purpose to that. It's not actually a state of recovery. But the question becomes is it the fact that things are irreversible is what makes someone dead? Or is it that we're in a situation where it's just permanent? And the reason why I stress this is because technology today is developing in all sorts of really wild ways. And one of these ways you might have seen in August of 2022, last year. I feel like last year seems like so long ago right now, like even like this past summer, like Sukkot feels like it was like 6 months ago, at the very least. I guess that's because of the war and stuff like that. And this feels like a really long time ago. This is over a year ago. And so over a year ago, scientists, I think this is a Yale-based research, announced that by, let me just pull this up, I can get the article here, that by placing a certain type of blood substitute, they call it organ X, right, into animals' bodies. In this case, it was a pig body. It was a solution that included the blood and 13 compounds, such as anticoagulants. And they were able to put this into the pig's body well after, full hour after the heart had stopped, and able to get heart contraction going again and activity in the liver and the kidneys. You understand? The heart's been dead. Stopped working for an hour. And then they send through this solution, which then is able to restore organ function, including heart contraction and activity in the liver and the kidneys. Okay, and similarly, we'll come back, and they did this as well, by the way, with regard to brain dead pigs as well. If you can see here, this is pig brains kept alive outside body for hours after death. Was another article. So now let's understand, if you have a solution that you can put in someone's body and get the heart beating again, well, then the loss of the heartbeat wasn't irreversible. It was permanent, but only permanent in the sense that we had no reason. We would have no reason. But suppose we have a situation where we could always use a solution, right? A liquid solution, and place in someone and get their heart beating again. Well, have they died? I mean, after all, it's not truly irreversible. Now, one of the reasons, of course, they're developing this technology is what they're interested in is, let's say a person has died. They get brought to the hospital. You put this liquid in, and you revitalize the heart, the lungs, the liver, whatever it might be. And you're able then to get the organ to be vital. Not the organism, but the organ to be vital, and retrieve those organs. I mean, that would be incredible. Look how about many more organs we'd be able to retrieve. But of course, once you start to get things functioning again, you have to ask, well, maybe this isn't actually the organs remain vital. What have you done? You've resuscitated the human being, the organism. And so you get to the point where it's actually not a situation where there actually is death. Because didn't we say that death is defined by things being irreversible? This is a very, very interesting development, which is causing all sorts of questions to start thinking about is how exactly do we define what it means to be dead? Now, this is not new per se. I mean, this question came up in different contexts. And one of the interesting ways where this question came up had to do with the issues of resuscitation in general, right? When CPR was sort of being developed. So one of the questions that came up was, well, let's say a person's heart is stopped and you do CPR. It used to be they did on the mouth, right, as well. But now we say we don't need that. You just need to do it with it hard pressing. By the way, the trick of how to know how to do it, the beat, is you sing the song "Staying Alive." You know the song "Staying Alive." I'm not gonna sing it right now. Rabbi's not supposed to know "Staying Alive," but this is a brilliant song, right, for these purposes. And when you sing, you got it, right? That's how you keep the beat of "Staying Alive." It's a brilliant thing that someone came up with. Okay, so that's the pace that you keep with. And then the question becomes well, you get the person to be resuscitated. Is that literally resuscitation? Is that like tchiyat hametim? And the nafkamina halachic terms was, is there wife after death? No, not life after death, but wife after death. What's the case? A man has cardiac arrest. He's stopped, his heart stopped, and then do CPR, and he's resuscitated. What do you say that this man has to now get remarried? Because death breaks the bonds of marriage. And now that he's alive again, you would say, right, they now have to get remarried again. So this actually was a bit of a machloket and discussion in the 50s and 60s. But as you can imagine, no one actually thinks, right, that you'd say, oh, this person was actually dead, because what turned out to be was pretty similar to other cases where you thought a person was dead, but intervention showed that they actually weren't dead. And were able to resuscitate the person. And so it turned out they actually weren't dead. But in our cases that we're talking about with this technology, you're going to have really interesting situations where it might become possible to say that even an hour, 2, 3, 4 after declaration of death by all criteria, because something has been stopped, the heart, breathing, whatever it might be, nonetheless, we're able to revive that organ. Is that going to throw the whole definition of death for a loop? And I can tell you that there's already discussion in medical and scientific and ethical circles that the definition of death should be changed, that it's no longer irreversible cessation of respiration or the heart, right, but rather permanent cessation, because nothing will actually truly be irreversible. Now, if that's the case, so you'd have a really interesting phenomenon. You could have situations where a person is permanently, right, they're dead because they have the permanent cessation of this critical organ, the heart, breathing, both. And then we're able to revive the heart and or lungs, whatever it is, but still declare that this person is not alive. How would you do that? And so you'd have to say there's a difference between the heart, let's say, as an organism, and the heart as the functional center of the body. What we care about for defining death is that there's the permanent cessation of the heart as functioning as a central, integral part of the body. And the fact that later on we can revitalize the heart on its own, but not in its role as the central functioning, integral, right, organizing, integral running of the body, that is a critical distinction, and therefore the person is still dead, even though we got their heart beating again. Friends, this is the future. It is clear that we're going to be in a situation, we're already there in many ways, but we're still going to be in a situation in which every organ is going to be revitalizable, right? They're going to be able to get some form of life out of those organs. And then the question is only going to be, are we willing to declare the person dead in those scenarios? This is a pretty remarkable phenomenon, and we'll see where this all goes. My own feeling on this is that this would not be a problem in a halachic sense, because we can make a distinction between the heart or the lung, respiratory system, or whatever else it is, in terms of the general integral functioning, as opposed to just saying that we can get it vital and revitalized, as it were, for organ donation. It's only alive, the human's only alive when it's functioning at a functional level. The problem, which is might emerge, is when we have the point where we can always revitalize the body to get things going again, even on an integral level. But you might say, what's the point? So let's let the person be dead. And then the question will emerge as though, but if it's not irreversibly dead, will that allow us to do organ retrieval? That, my friend, is the next frontier when it comes to organ donation. In the meantime, right? In the meantime, we've experimented with this on pigs, and it seems that this is where the technology is going. But in the meantime, I think we can be rest assured that there is such a thing as death, that there is death that is irreversible, and that this is certainly permanent, and one can accept this. Now, my own view on the organ donation issue is, as an organization, we help people in both scenarios, whether or not they accept it or not. But I do accept myself the practice of the chief rabbi of Israel that accepts brainstem death, and therefore will allow full organ donation. Right? And the reason why we call it our initiative Option 18 is because we wanted it to stress the fact that 18, of course, means chai, right? For us, this means chai. That's the connotation it has, but it also has the connotation in general society of the organ donation world that one person can save 8 lives. You look at my background, you see that's why we created that slogan here. One person can save 8 lives. So we're playing around with 18, both chai and that phenomenon as well. Okay, I'll take questions here. Should this emerging technology issue be addressed in a person's advanced health directive? Thank you, Len, for the question. I don't think that this is so critical because an advanced healthcare directive, what you want to say is that given when the halachic definition of death emerges, that'll be sufficient in order to allow me. And we're going to work this out, meaning, my kids, they shift to 120. My oldest is 18. By the time she gets to 120, who knows, right, what's going to be, right, in terms of this technology. It's pretty wild to think about what will be possible. But in the meantime, the advanced directives should be formulated in a way where if it is deemed death by halacha, then that should allow organ donation. In fact, in our Amatai's healthcare directive, in what we're calling the Tivot, which I think I mentioned last week. So let me see if I can just find it real fast. So we're very careful in our formulation of this in order to make it available and possible, right? Given all these changes that are going on in the technology. Let me show you the formulation we did here. This is the Ontario version, but for this purpose, it's the same in the American version as well. It'll be the same in the Quebec version, which are finishing up right now. And so if you see here, we're actually this section is applicable only if death as defined by Jewish law and custom has been determined by my attorney in consultation with my named rabbinic consultant. Meaning, whatever is the definition of death, if that has happened, this will allow organ donation. Right, so that's, Len, I think one of the reasons why we formulated that way is precisely because I am utterly confident that organ donation is going to be possible in many, many different scenarios, more scenarios in the future than it is today. Joyce, you asked if heart and or lungs are revitalized 1 to 2 hours after death, would the brain remain non-functioning and person still be unquestionably dead? So yes, Joyce, I mean, that's true. If, like, this is the case that we're trying now in the protocol in New York, you're essentially going to revitalize the lungs, but the breathing is going to have stopped, right? So that's not going to be an issue. But the point I'm trying to get to is that it will have the technology, if we have, assuming I think we will have the technology that will allow for any of the organs to be revitalized. Now, the fact that we haven't revitalized them means that it's permanently stopped working, but it's not irreversible. But you're right. As long as we don't keep on playing around too much and just try to revitalize the lungs, that'll be one thing. But if you think that the heart or the lungs, right, is like the definition, it's a key, criterion for death, then once you get that going again, you might say, well, maybe the person's alive. And so this is why it gets really tricky. In fact, I didn't want to overly confuse this, but I will show you that there's a huge, huge controversy going on today in hospitals already over the following procedure. The procedure is called NRP-DCD. Okay, and they use it through an ECMO machine. And it's it's a pretty wild process. But what they're doing is they allow patients to die and they restart the hearts after they die. So you say, oh, they restart the hearts. How is it possible that they're dead? And so what they do is that they attach this machine in order to revitalize the heart. The ECMO machine revitalizes the heart. And then they clamp, however, a central artery to the brain to make it a case of brain death. So the heart stops. You then stop any potential blood flow to the brain. Therefore, it's brain death. And then you attach the ECMO machine and revitalize the heart. This is a massive, massive debate where the American College of Physicians, for example, has said that they are against this idea because they feel that they're sort of playing around with the definition of death and playing around with the dead donor rule. Because after all, originally you said the person was dead because they stopped their blood, right? There's irreversible, you said it was irreversible loss of circulation. But it wasn't really irreversible because once you put the ECMO machine on, you got it going again. So how they died? You manipulated the body to cause brain death and then reverse the loss of circulation. So this is a massive, massive debate that's going on in medical circles today. And it just raises, and it's going on. I mean, to give you an example, in New York City alone, NYU does this process, Columbia won't. Okay? Same city, right? Colleagues. Right? And there's a lot at stake in this debate, and it's very, very, very heated. The other issue, particularly for the Canadians here in the room, that we should be aware of is that, organ donation can be played around with a lot of different ways, particularly when you're doing euthanasia. So Canada, as you might know, they're pioneering. I don't use that term in a complimentary sense in euthanasia. In fact, the stats just came out for 2022. 4.1% of all deaths in Canada happen through euthanasia. 4.1% of all deaths in Canada happen through euthanasia, over, I think, about 14,000 people. And there are certain cases where they do euthanasia organ donation, meaning they'll say, I want to be put to death, right, because I have ALS or some other horrible disease. And when you do that, do it in a way where you can immediately retrieve organs for organ donation. So you see, once again, all those ethical issues are coming up here, right? In other words, here you have something which is a highly controversial, right, way of dying, highly controversial, either active liberty or active murder, depending on how you think about euthanasia, and you're throwing organ donation into the mix. There's a lot going on. So this is why I was getting to Joyce was saying beforehand, is that the manipulation of the body and the manipulation of the way of making things, nothing is going to be irreversible, raises a lot of interesting issues. And we need to be there on the forefront of thinking about these issues and about thinking about making sure that we can come up with a rational and reasonable definition of death, which once again is not a scientific question. Science will tell us how the organism stops functioning. Science will tell us what it can revive, what it can't revive. We have to decide if what has been resuscitated or revived makes a person alive, again, or keeps them alive, if you will, or is it still maintain them as being dead? That is the next frontier in these questions. heavy topic. I was trying to think of like a joke or something like that, to part with, but I guess you're used to my humor already, so we don't go in that direction. All right. Any other questions? You're welcome to unmute and ask. I'll stick around. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all next week at our final class for this series. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Brody. Good to see you.
Likewise.
Thank you, Shlomo.
Thank you very much.